All right, it's 1:40, so let's go ahead and get started. So welcome everybody. My name is Scott, and today I'm going to be talking to you about 10 things I do on every .NET app. If you want to grab these slides, you can grab it from my blog. It's just my first and last name, scottsauber.com. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm Scott Sauber there. And yes, I still call it Twitter. I refuse to call it X. So I am on Twitter there. All right, just to make sure you're in the right room because you have a lot of options of talks at your disposal. The audience I'm talking to here is primarily .NET developers and .NET developers who are interested in maintainable applications. And hopefully that Venn diagram is more of like a circle. Hopefully all .NET developers care about maintainability. But yeah, hopefully you are in the right room. So I'm not going to read all these things off, but I'm going to talk about all these things you see listed here. And how this talk is structured is as a series of lightning talks. So what I find is most talks that are like 60 minutes, I usually get like a few minutes of tidbits from it that are valuable. So how I've tried to structure this is I try and condense all these topics down to roughly about 5 minutes each so that you get the most value out of this, and I have to not do a bunch of storytelling and filler words and all that kind of stuff. You just get the raw stuff and the raw information that you want. So my goals out of this is to give you exposure to new ideas before you go back to work, because some of you have to justify why you came to NDC Oslo. So hopefully you can take a few tips to your boss on ideas on what you can do going on in the future. And odds are you probably aren't going to agree with all of my opinions, and that's totally okay. We all have different contexts. We all have different situations. I'm just throwing out some ideas that have worked well for me. So who am I? I'm the Director of Engineering at Lean Techniques. As you might have guessed, I'm from the US based on my accent. Lean Techniques is a software consulting company of roughly 140 people. We're based in the Midwest, but have people in 20 or so states. And a lot of what we do is we teach people more modern engineering practices and also teach people how to build products that people want. So some of the stuff I talk about here are things that we preach to our customers. We work with like Fortune 500 companies down to startups and kind of everything in between. As well as I do have two of my coworkers here today, including my boss, Tim. So hopefully things go well for me today and I don't screw up too bad. I'm also a Microsoft MVP. I'm also a Dome Train author, and Nick Chapsis, who runs Dome Train, was here today as well. And then I also have my wife here today for the first time watching my talk. So I've got my boss at work, my boss at my side hustle, and my boss at home here at the conference today. So yeah, and maybe making a joke at my wife's expense before we hop on a plane tomorrow for 10 hours isn't the best idea, but we'll see how that works out. I'm also a Reg8 community ambassador, and I help run the Iowa.NET user group. We do post stuff online and do a lot of virtual and hybrid events, so if you're interested, you can join that, but it is about a 7-hour time difference. All right, enough about that. Let's kind of frame up this conversation before we get into all these different tips and tricks I'm going to talk about. So I really like this tweet by Guillermo Rauch. He tweeted this back in 2016. And if you don't know Guillermo, he's the guy who created Socket.io, which is kind of like the SignalR equivalent of Node, as well as he created a company called Vercel, who makes Next.js that you may have heard of. But he said this, of every system tends towards complexity, slowness, and difficulty, and staying simple, fast, and easy to use is a battle that must be fought every single day. And I really like this quote because that resonates with my experience. Like, it's super easy to just kind of, you come across like a 1,000-line method and you're like, oh, I just need to add like 4 more lines. Like, what's the difference between a 1,000-line method and a 1,004-line method? And, people thought that when it was 800 lines and 600 lines and 200 lines. And eventually you kind of need to draw a stake in the ground and say, hey, we need to make this a lot less complex. As well as if you don't keep your eye on this, if it starts very simple and very easy to maintain, then eventually, if you don't keep your eye on that ball, then eventually things just kind of spiral out of control, and then you might have to do the great rewrite that will fix all the things. As we all know, rewrites always work, but that's a whole nother conversation. So I really like this tweet, and I think that this kind of frames up, like, I'm focusing on maintainability in a lot of these things, because the only consistent thing in software is change. Like, technologies change, requirements change, businesses change, COVID kind of slapped us all in the face 5 years ago, so things just changed that we don't really control. And so I try to optimize for change. All right. With that, let's talk about folder structure. So we'll kind of hit on a lot of these different topics as we go. So here's the problem is when you go file a new project, and let's just say we pick MVC and do like a traditional server rendered app, so no Blazor, no Angular, React, none of that stuff, is anytime you need to add a new feature, you kind of have to bounce around to all these different folders. You have to go to the controllers folder, the views folder, the models folder, CSS, JavaScript. Like you have to touch all these different folders that are kind of scattered throughout your application, right? And this just adds some navigation friction because now in order to like add new features and stuff, you got to bounce around to all these different spots. So your scope of your feature is like just scattered throughout your project. And if you ever need to delete a feature, now you need to go find all these different files to go delete. Or if you need to add a new feature, you have to go put them all in all these different folders. And also extending new features, you got to touch all these different files all over the place. So what do I like to do? I like to do a concept called feature folders. So this is the idea of grouping by feature, not technical responsibility, which in my opinion results in easier maintenance, and it results in this thing called high cohesion, which is just a fancy word for saying related things should remain together. So MVC out of the box, like let's say I'm adding a My Profile feature, for instance, I got to go touch all these different folders, and like this is just like a very small example too. You can imagine as you add more features, this gets even crazier. So what I do is usually I'll create like a My Profile feature folder and then add, whatever is relevant there, like the controller, the view model, CSS/HTML file, whatever technology I'm using. And I also do this in React. So I've done a lot of React in my career. I'll also do that in React to like co-locate the component and even the test when I'm in React land right next to the component that it's testing. And like even in Blazor too, when I'm doing Blazor, I'll do the same thing. And in this situation, I have like an alert type enum that's relevant just to this alert component, and I'll co-locate that with the same folder too. But a lot of people will be like, but I have all these layers, right? And I used to do that too. I used to have like a data project, a business project, a common project, a models project, an API project, and all these different layers, but I found I don't actually get a lot of value from that. So usually now I just do 2 projects. It might be like core or something else where like a lot of the business logic lives. And then whatever my entry point is, whether that's an API, web, console, worker, whatever the case is. So I usually just have 2 projects and I slice the folders vertically here too. So I'll slice them by like my profile in those cases. Plus I'll also have corresponding test projects for those too. And we'll talk about automated tests a little bit later. The only time I really slice horizontally is if I'm like publishing a NuGet package either internally or externally, in which case, I want to make sure that the dependencies are clean and all that kind of stuff. But for most applications, people aren't usually doing that. A lot of times you just have one consumer with your projects and that's your application. So that's the only time I deviate from this strategy. So I've got a blog that I wrote in 2016 about this, as well as some other blogs and YouTubes if you're interested about this. But I kind of want to leave you with like one final analogy to think about this. So I want you to think about where do you keep the soap in your like house or apartment or wherever you live, right? Do you keep them all together in the same soap closet? Like you've got the hand soap, the shampoo, the body soap, laundry detergent, all that kind of stuff. Do you keep all your different types of soap in the same closet? Because it's all soap, right? Probably not. Any psychos who do that? Nobody. Okay. So you probably keep it where you use it, right? You keep the hand soap by the sink, you keep the shampoo and the body soap in the shower, like all of those kinds of things. So I want you to think about like, why don't you apply that same concept? Because you're creating high cohesion in your house by doing that. So why don't you apply that same logic to your code? All right, that is feature folders. So let's talk about warnings. Has anybody ever opened up a project and you went to go build it and you got like hundreds or even thousands of warnings? Okay, about half the room and the other half of you are liars because everybody has. How many people enjoyed that experience seeing all those warnings? Nobody. Still no psycho in the room. Cool. So in my world, warnings don't exist. It should either be an error that I care about and I fix, or I explicitly ignore the warning because of whatever reason. Like I know this warning won't actually come up. So I treat warnings as errors, which in .NET, if you crack open your CS proj and flip this flag, treat warnings as errors true, you'll be able to treat your warnings as errors going forward. And I find, especially new projects, please do this from the very beginning, because if you don't, you will have warnings and you'll see all these different warnings. You're like, I don't know which ones of these are relevant, which ones of these can I ignore? So try and do this from the very beginning. All right. Now we're going to talk about logging best practices. And I have best practices in quotes because I personally hate the term best practices, because it's almost always context dependent. Like we all know the right answer for any technology question, which is, anybody? It depends. It depends. And so when you say something's a best practice, it's usually like, well, it's a best practice in this particular context, right? But I'm going to talk about some stuff that's worked for me and just some stuff I see clients struggle with over the years. So this might be spicy to some people. I prefer using Serilog as a logging framework. Nothing against nlog or log4net, just Serilog works well for me. If you're using nlog or log4net and it's working well for you, don't feel like you have to switch or anything like that. Also, please use iLogger everywhere. So the only place that should know about Serilog is in like the bootstrap of your application in like the program.cs. You shouldn't be using Serilog or log4net or nlog directly in any of your applications. That way, if you ever want to switch for whatever reason, you're using this iLogger abstraction, not the dependency directly. But use structured logging, not concatenation. So what I mean by that is, in this example here, the top is using concatenation where you're saying, hey, I'm retrieving user with the ID of whatever. And the problem is that's just like a string. So basically to search through this, you have to like basically do like a find in like a notepad file essentially, even if you're logging to some other external provider. Versus if you do the bottom way, where you're not using string interpolation, you're passing these along for the ride, then you can actually query on these things, and basically it throws it essentially into a database column in like Azure Log Analytics, if you're using Elk Stack, whatever it is that you're using. So use structured logging if you can. But something to note is Azure Log Analytics workspaces do cap at 500 unique columns. So eventually they'll just kind of chuck it into like an additional data or other data column. So just be aware of that limitation. As well as each log should have some key information on it. So things like user ID or a correlation ID. So that way you can track like a single request going across different services and be able to track like, hey, what's going on across all these different services. Things like the request URL, maybe like the application version. So you know, and usually in the application version, I like including the git SHA, the short SHA, so that way you know exactly what commit it was that's deployed out in the real world. So that way, if like there's a bug that comes up and you fix it, you can compare like, hey, do we get any more exceptions in the latest version that we were getting previously? And you don't have to do this on every single log statement. Like when you do this log debug thing, you don't have to pass it along for the ride every time. You can set it up in something called Serilog's log context. So Google Serilog's log context if you're not using that, and you can set it up globally in a single spot, and then all future logs will get that information. But I want to talk about this, we need to log that. Like I see a lot of requirements where we say, oh, we need to log that information. Like, hey, we've got a user management system and we need to log who made this change, like who added this new user, who changed their permissions. Like we need to make sure we log that information. And I feel like that phrase is very overloaded. And sometimes we're like, oh, log, I have an iLogger, I'm going to chuck it in my logs. And that might not be the best place for it. So let's talk about logs versus metrics versus audits. And I'm not going to get into like spans and traces with OpenTelemetry, but I just want to talk about these kind of different concepts. So with logs, these really should be developer focused. Like you shouldn't be giving this to your business people. These are things like, you know, exceptions that happen with stack traces, or, you know, maybe you want to log a response from different external APIs or different steps in the process, things like that. You really should not be using logs for anything other than developers. As well as I find a lot of people abuse different log levels. Like a lot of people just chuck everything into information when really maybe they shouldn't. So what the original intent of these is debug is supposed to be individual steps like, hey, maybe you need to call 3 APIs. You want to log the responses from each one of those APIs. That really should be a debug statement, not information. Information is meant to be like at the end of a request, hey, we processed, this many records in this amount of time, or whatever the case is. Really, information should be like summaries, and you really should have only one of those per request. Another one I see people get mixed up too is they don't use warning when maybe they should. So some people will use errors too much, and really what warnings are like, hey, if you have one of those, it's not a big deal, but maybe if you have a bunch of those, it is. So a classic example of this is, let's say you've got some user system and like a user getting locked out of their account for 5 minutes. By itself, a single user getting locked out for 5 minutes is not a big deal. But if you have thousands of those happening in a short period of time, maybe something's going on here, and maybe people are trying to get into your system. So warnings are kind of things that like you don't really care about by themselves, but in the aggregate, you might care about. Whereas errors are like, this is your classic unhandled exceptions, and I find so many people have, like, anybody who wants to admit it, even though this is a safe space, anybody get a bunch of errors that you just ignore? Yes, it's okay. Again, the rest of you, liars, because we've all been there. So I try not to be in that situation and try and like, okay, it's an error, let's root cause it, figure out if we care about it, and maybe we need to like downgrade the log level, maybe it's more of a warning, maybe there's a bug there, whatever the case is. And finally, critical, or sometimes it's called fatal too. This is like my application can't boot. Like maybe I need to talk to a database first, or maybe I need to talk to like Azure Key Vault to pull secrets. This is basically like, hey, my app can't boot, and so I've got a fatal or critical error. So again, a lot of people use information when they probably meant debug. And again, try and clean up your warnings and errors so that way you're not ignoring all these errors, because the worst person to report issues to you are your users. But to go back to my earlier statement about, hey, we need to log that, something you need to think about is, okay, how long does my log store keep logs? Because like Azure Log Analytics, for instance, by default only keeps for 30 days. Which, if you're doing this stuff, it's not a big deal if they're developer focused. But if you're trying to keep like historical stuff of like, hey, who changed what, and your product person says, hey, can you pull the last 6 months of information on this? It's not a good place to be if you're like, oh, we only keep the last 30 days. Like that's probably something that a situation you don't want to be in. So you got to think about, hey, how long does my log store keep logs? As well as how Serolog works. So if I go back to well, I won't go all the way back. But when we looked at that log debug statement that I have, how Serolog works is it doesn't immediately like send it to Azure Log Analytics or AWS CloudWatch or wherever you're sending your logs to. What it does is it actually buffers that log message in memory, and then after a period of time, it flushes those out. And the idea behind that is if your logging provider's down, they don't want to take down your whole application or reduce your performance either. So then what happens if somebody like pulls the power on your running application suddenly? You lose your logs that were sitting in memory. So that can be okay in some situations, especially if you're doing logs how you should be. But if you're using logs to like keep historical data, that's probably not a good position to be in to keep track of those logs. So again, you got to think about how this logger works under the hood. All right, and then that leads me into metrics. So there's two types of metrics. There's like application level metrics, things like CPU, network, memory, queue depth, network bandwidth, how many ports HTTP clients using, all of those kinds of things. And then there's like business ones like, hey, how many orders were placed, or how many times people clicked this button, or how many people viewed this page. And again, you have to think about how long do we need to keep this metric data? And this should be a conversation with the business that you're working with of like, hey, how long do you want to keep this information? How long do you want to access it? Because again, logs might not be the right place for that, but a lot of times I see people throw things into logs that maybe should not be thrown into. So again, this may or may not be acceptable to miss some data. So like, not keeping your CPU response or CPU time indefinitely is probably fine because you probably only care about, the last week or last month or so. But if you're trying to use this to keep track of how many orders were placed, well, that's probably not fine to miss some data. So again, you have to think about where should you store some of these metrics. And finally, I want to talk about audits. So this is recording who did what and when in your application. So usually this is like legal reasons or compliance reasons, or again, like traceability reasons, like I mentioned earlier, with like a user management system saying, hey, I want to track like who added this user, who changed their permissions, all of those kinds of things. And this is a situation where losing any data is not acceptable. So I don't know, do you guys have HIPAA here? I think that's just a US only thing. All right. Well, HIPAA is like for health insurance and health requirements and things like that, where we have to keep data for 7 years, and losing any of that data is unacceptable. So in those cases, you do not want to be using logs at all. And in general, the easiest way is just store your audits in the same data store that you're using to store that data. So like SQL Server, Postgres, MySQL, like all of those have atomic transactions and things like that built in. So it either all succeeds or all fails, and you can never lose any data where like, oh, we made this change, but we don't have any record of who made that change, right? So just do the simple thing and store it in the same data store and get those easy, simple guarantees. All right. That is logging best practices. So those are just some things that I've seen people mess up in the industry. And so just wanted you to think about like when somebody says, hey, we need to log that next time, think about like, hey, what data store am I using? How long do we need this data? Things of that. That's kind of the takeaway from this section. All right. Next, we're going to talk about a global authorized attribute via a fallback policy. So the problem when you go like file new project in .NET is security is opt-in. And honestly, this is a problem in a lot of tech stacks, not just .NET. So the problem is if you're using like controllers, for instance, which I still see a lot of people using controllers, which is totally fine, you have to remember to add this like authorized attribute everywhere throughout all of your controllers and your actions. Or you have to remember to inherit from like some base controller that has that authorized attribute on it. But the problem is if you forget, it's like, oops, you're wide open to the world, which is probably not a good place to be. And we've come into new clients and found out that, oops, they forgot to add an authorized attribute and some data was exposed to the whole world, which is not a fun conversation to have on day number 1 of being at a new client. So the solution for this is something called a fallback policy in ASP.NET Core. So how the fallback policy works is if you don't specify another policy, this one will run every single time. So how you do that is in your DI container, you just do this add authorization and set this fallback policy. You can create a policy however you want, but I'm just using the authorization policy builder here, and I'm saying, hey, require an authenticated user. So again, this only runs if you put nothing else on the controller. So let's say, or controller action. So let's say you have endpoint that you want to do like allow anonymous. If you put that attribute, that's going to override this. Or you can say like, hey, you must be an admin or something to hit this endpoint. That's going to override this. But this is, hey, if you put nothing, this is what gets evaluated. So now you're secure by default, and at least you have to be logged in order to hit that endpoint. And obviously you can make this do whatever you want. You can say like, hey, you have to have this custom claim or whatever the case is. Like you can have this do whatever it is that you want. All right, that is security. So now we're going to talk about validation. All right, so again, I'm going to talk about what's wrong with things out of the box. How many people have ever used data annotations? Okay, most of the room. So I don't really like data annotations, and I'll tell you why. I think they only really work for simple scenarios because, like, let's say you have like a property and you say like, hey, I want to mark this as required, and oh, by the way, it should be an email address, and like you just have to like stack up all these different annotations on this property. And then what happens when you want to make a custom one? Well, now I have to like extend this base class, and it's kind of like weird to deal with, and I don't really like it. It's also hard to write an automated test for. And what I found too is separate annotations can get kind of tall for each property, and you can have like really tall properties of annotations on a model. And if you want to get like super nerdy and more like architectural stuff, you could make the argument that the single responsibility principle is also violated because you're combining like your model with validation in the same class. So what I do instead is I use Fluent validation. How many people have used Fluent validation? Okay, big chunk of the room, probably like a third of the room. Sweet. So what this is it's a Fluent interface, and it allows you to create maintainable business rules that are easy to read. Like I've literally screenshotted rules and sent it to a business person and said, hey, are these the right validation rules for this? And they totally can read how those validation rules look. And I'll show an example here in a second. They're also easy to test. Like Fluent validation adds like a test helper for you too that makes these super easy to write automated tests for. They also integrate with Model State if you're using Model State, and it has 634 million downloads as of yesterday. So quite a few people are using Fluent validation. There's the GitHub link if you're interested, but honestly, if you just Google fluentvalidation.net, it should be the first thing that pops up. So this is kind of like out of the box if you do file new project and set up like by default it'll set up like a registration page and things like that to sign up for a user. And you can see like all those arrows are links to different validation rules that are implemented via data annotations. So if I re-implement this with Fluent validation, basically I rip out all those annotations, and then I can do something that's more here on the right, where, and I can zoom in on that a little bit. So what you do here is you inherit from this abstract validator thing and say, hey, this is the type I'm using, a register view model. And then in the constructor, you can just start writing these rules. Like you can see there's like a not empty one. There's an email address one. You can provide custom messages here. You can also set up like global messages. So like I always want it to, when I say, hey, I want this to not be empty or not null, I want it to say this property is required, all those kinds of things. So you can do that in a global fashion. I'm just kind of being repetitive here. You can set up maximum lengths, minimum lengths. Like a lot of this stuff is kind of built in out of the box, which is pretty nice to read. So literally I've like screenshotted something similar to this and sent this to a business person. They're like, oh yeah, I get it. Because it's pretty easy to read even if you're not technical. Now, you can also write custom rules. So for instance, in the US, when you hit the age of 26, you can no longer be on your parents' health insurance, which, I don't know, health insurance is kind of a spicy topic. I'm not going to get into it, but that's a rule that we have in the US. So for instance, in this case, we can say, hey, when the current insurance enrollment, when their age is less than 26, or they have to be less than 26 when they're a dependent. Otherwise, you pop up this message saying, hey, you have to be under 26. So that's like a custom rule that was super easy to write, super easy to follow. And again, business people can read that pretty easily as well. All right, so that is validation and why I don't like data annotations and alternative solution for that. All right, so next thing we're going to talk about is we're going to remove the server header that comes out of the box in ASP.NET Core, which many of you probably don't even know that this thing even exists. So by default, ASP.NET Core adds a server header, and assuming you're using Kestrel, which most people are, that value will say Kestrel. Does anybody know why they put this in the box? Why did they do this? And don't think too hard. The simplest answer is probably the answer. It's not a good reason. What's that? Because they could? Well, yeah, they could and they did. So the reason is they want to know how many people are using ASP.NET Core. So they want to go and see all the different websites that are out there that are using ASP.NET Core. So they want to be able to say like, oh, the response header says Kestrel, which they did this in ASP.NET like full framework too. And it was actually way worse because they'd also put in like the version of MVC and .NET that you were using. And the reason why this is bad is this now exposes to black hats what you're running, people who are trying to break into your systems. So when they see this, they go, oh, I don't need to check any of the Java vulnerabilities or the Node vulnerabilities or Python vulnerabilities. I can just focus on the .NET ones. Now, removing this doesn't save you from any of that, but like it extends the amount of time that people have to check into these things. So like the less information you can give to the world, the better. And honestly, once you put a website on the internet, within 30 minutes, it's going to get scanned by some script kiddie or somebody who's trying to hack into your website. So if you've got a public website out there, I guarantee you your site has been hit by various things. So again, this allows hackers to focus on known vulnerabilities that are in .NET because they know, hey, you're probably running .NET if you have this Kestrel server header. So it's super easy to remove. You just go into your builder.webhost.use Kestrel and say add server header equals false. So, and again, feel free to take pictures, but I also post these slides publicly, so and I'll post it in the Slack channel as well, so you have this. But this is a super easy way to just remove this, so now you don't have that server header being sent over the wire. And if any of you get like any like external penetration tests for like people trying to break into your systems who are doing like audits and things like that, they'll also usually flag this if you're doing some of this stuff. All right. So that is removing the server header. Now we're going to talk about don't use iOptions, which is a bit spicy because a lot of people use iOptions out of the box. So the problem with iOptions is you need this dependency on Microsoft extensions .options, and if you're using this like down in your other CS projects or anything, you also have to bring in the dependency to those CS projects, which is kind of annoying. As well as testing, like if you write unit tests around iOptions, it can be kind of annoying, and you have to do this options.create thing because you can't mock it for some other reasons I'm not going to get into. And you also have to do .value everywhere. So like for instance, if I have this example, this weather forecast controller where I'm injecting in iOptions, now to actually get at the value of my configuration, I have to do in this case, app settings.value whatever it is that I'm trying to do. Which like it's a small thing, but it's just kind of annoying to deal with, right? So what I do instead is I register my iOptions class directly. So that way I'm dealing with just, in this case, my app settings class, the whatever POCO that you've registered. So I do the configure thing like you normally would. And then in this case, I'm adding a singleton and saying, hey, grab me the iOptions and then register that value as a singleton in your application. Now, if you want to in this case, I'm saying, hey, the configuration never changes. If you are in a situation where like you're changing your configuration on the fly, you can still do this pattern. You just register it as a scoped instead. And instead of iOptions, you use iOption snapshot. So you still have that option at your disposal. But now when I consume it, you can see I'm not injecting in an iOptions of app settings. I'm just injecting in app settings. So it's a little bit nicer. And now all my consuming applications just depend on my like straight up POCO. I don't have to have that dependency. That's super easy to deal with. So that is why I don't use iOptions and what I do instead. All right. Let's talk a little bit about code smells here, which is definitely a subjective topic. So when I structure a method in C# or really any language, I try and put the happy path at the bottom of the method. And there's a number of different reasons why I do this. Is I don't want to see like in the middle of the method, hey, like, you know, I'm looking at some code I've never seen before. Like I want to know like, hey, when everything goes right, what happens, right? And we'll look at an example of this here in a second. I want to just like go look at the bottom of the method and see like, okay, here's everything that went well, that goes well. When everything goes well, here's what happens in this method. So how I do this is I use a technique called early returns. So I use return statements instead of nested if-elses, and we'll look at an example here in a second. So again, if you go File, New Project, and scaffold out, in this case, Razor's Pages template, which, you know, again, registers a new user is what this is doing. You'll notice a few things. So first off, the happy path is right here in the very center of the method. And this isn't actually even a big method. This is like a 20-ish line method. But it's still kind of like hard at a glance to see like, hey, where's the happy path here? And so what happens is when you register on a site and you get a new account, we do a few things. We log some information. We get a URL to throw into an email to say, hey, click on this to confirm your email, and then we go ahead and sign them in and do a local redirect. And what's funny is somebody at Microsoft put this comment in here that says, if we got this far, something failed, so redisplay the form. And what I've noticed is when you put comments like this that explains, hey, this is what this code does, that's probably a bad sign that maybe this could be a little bit more clear. So I think it's kind of funny that this comes out of the box from somebody at Microsoft. So again, what I would do is I would use a concept called early returns. And so now I say, like right at the beginning, hey, if the model state's not valid, go ahead and return the page immediately. And so now I know if I've gotten past this code, the user typed in all the correct information. And then I try and create the user. If that doesn't succeed, then I display to the user what happened. So maybe like, hey, they have already signed up on the site or whatever the case is. And then here's my happy path at the bottom where it's saying, hey, if everything went well, we do the same stuff and eventually send them an email and log them in. So what usually happens when you do early returns is you end up having less nested ifs and for eaches and those kinds of things, which I find as you have more nesting, it's harder to maintain your code. Which leads me to this concept of the indentation proclamation, which the idea here is the more indented your code is, the harder it is to follow. And so this is like if you got like 4 nested ifs, it's hard to keep track of like, hey, where am I at in this chain? Or like nested loops and stuff like that. And if any of you are Googling, hey, what's this indentation proclamation thing? I made this up. This is not something you can look up. I just like it because it rhymes and it's easy for people to remember. And so think about like, hey, the more indented my code is, the harder it is to maintain. All right, so some generic code smells as well. These are not hard and fast rules. These are just my warning lights, and this will offend, I guarantee, some of you, or make you feel like I hate your code. That's probably not the case, but these are just kind of my warning light of like, hey, maybe I should think about refactoring here. So if methods are more than 20 lines or classes are more than 200 lines, I start thinking to myself, hey, maybe I could break this out, or maybe there's multiple concepts here, whatever the case is. As well as if you use regions. I really wish if you used regions, Clippy, our friend Clippy, would pop up and say, hey, it looks like you're trying to create a region. Did you mean to create a new method or a class instead? Because usually people use regions for code organization, and we already have a built-in way of doing that, which is methods and classes. So in general, I don't like regions. So again, I try and avoid regions wherever possible. And I feel like if you need to organize your code in that way, that might be an example that, hey, maybe we should break this code up a little bit more. All right, sorry for all the region fan people that I offended there. All right, next we're going to move on to modern solution files. So this is a pretty new feature that I'm guessing, like, is anybody using a new solution file already? Ooh, probably like 5-10% of the room. Cool. So if anybody's ever cracked open a solution file in .NET, you're going to be greeted with something like this. And this is just like a file new project solution file. And this is like a custom file format. I don't even know what's going on here really. And it's really kind of intimidating. So like usually when I accidentally crack it open, because I don't mean to, I just immediately try and close it as fast as possible so I don't screw something up. What a modern solution file is using our good friend XML. Yes, XML is modern. At least in Microsoft land. But XML is what we deal with CS Projects. And so now solution files look like this, which is a lot easier to read and maintain than our old solution file format. So this just pretty recently in the last couple months came out. So it's in .NET SDK version 9.0.200. Technically, this feature is still in preview, but it's pretty stable now. So like they're going to fully release it into .NET 10, but you can feel free to use it now if you wish. And you can easily migrate existing solutions by just going to the folder where your solution file exists and say .NET SLN migrate. And it'll generate you a solution X file, so an SLNX file. So now you can open that. You will need to be on near the latest Visual Studio or Writer for them to know what to do with that. But that's an easy way to move to the new solution file. And then just remember to delete the other solution file because you won't need it anymore. But by default, it does not delete it when you do the migrate. So that is modern solution files. Next, I'm going to talk about HTTP security headers. So what HTTP security headers are they tell a browser to enforce some extra rules. What this means is you can prevent certain types of attacks like man-in-the-middle, clickjacking, cross-site scripting, and a lot of others. However, be careful here because you can do things like say, hey, nobody should load JavaScript files from any URL or any domain other than my own, which is fine as long as you're not using you're loading JavaScript or CSS from like a CDN or something like that. So if you get some of these rules wrong, you will break your application. But what people usually get tripped up on here too, besides that, is they won't realize what their application's doing, and then they might break some feature on your app. But there are strategies on how to adopt this incrementally if you're trying to retrofit this onto an existing app. But if anybody gets scanned by, again, some external penetration tests or external security companies, they always check this stuff. So you're going to be, this stuff is going to get brought up. And if you look at a lot of public sites like securityheaders.com, which will scan your site and tell you what you have and what you don't, roughly half of websites out there have 0 security headers whatsoever. And only 10% have an A or an A+. It's pretty bad. So I'm bringing it up because most companies, most websites out there don't have this. There's also a package out there by a guy named Andrew Locke. If you've ever Googled anything in .NET, you've probably landed onto his blog. But this is a package out there to implement some security headers. I've got a whole talk talking about this at NDC London too, and it's an hour-long talk. I only have 5 minutes on this topic, or a few minutes, and so I'm not going to get into all the nuances, but if you want to check more out, you can do that there. All right, next conversation, build once, deploy many times. So I try and discourage long-running branches in what's called Git flow, so having environment branches of dev, test, UAT, production, all that kind of stuff. I really just try and encourage one long-running branch, which is your main branch. And this encourages something called trunk-based development, so that's what that concept's called, even if you're doing pull requests. And there's actually a lot of people out there who agree with me on this, and this isn't just my idea. A lot of people are doing this, I'm sure many of you are doing this, but I still see a lot of people using Git flow for workflow. And Atlassian, the people who make Jira, Confluence, all those kinds of things, is they've called this a legacy workflow. And there's actually research out there that promotes trunk-based development as well. And there's actually independent research where they've talked to tens of thousands of companies and found out that Git flow does not work or prevents people from reaching the outcomes that they want. So there's actually independent research out there that shows hey, trunk-based is a better way of managing your Git repositories. So then I have environmental differences live in the environment. So again, the idea here is you build once, you do a .NET publish, grab all your DLLs, and then promote those same DLLs throughout all your environments. So you don't rebuild or oh, I want to promote to another environment now I need to remerge this code into a different branch. You just build once and then deploy those same artifacts many times. And then those environmental differences live in the environment. You pull secrets from a different Azure Key Vault and those kinds of things. So that is build once, deploy many times. All right, next we're going to talk about validate on build. Does anybody know what this feature is? Just by the name. This is a pretty obscure one. Maybe one? Seeing a little bit of oh, I think I know. Oh, no, I don't want him to call on me. Never mind. I don't know that one. So validate on build is this idea that it basically validates that your dependency injection container is wired up correctly. So if you think about it, singletons can only depend on singletons, not a scoped or a transient in DI containers, because otherwise they're not a singleton, right? So it kind of makes sense. A singleton can't depend on a scoped or a transient. Otherwise, by definition, it's not a singleton. So if you don't do this, if you have a singleton that depends on a scoped or a transient, this leads to something called the captive dependency problem, which is basically you've got this dependency that's captured in a singleton and it can't dispose of itself, which can lead to bad things like if it's a DB context, you can have connections never close, things like that. So ASP Encore will catch this if you're running in development mode locally, but not other environments. So for instance, if you have a custom environment name like local, or if you call it dev or something like that, you actually won't catch this problem until it gets deployed out to production, and you may see issues that you can't really explain in production. So for instance, to show an example of this, let's say I've got a singleton, in this case called singleton thing, and a scoped called scope thing. And the singleton thing depends on the scoped thing. So now I've got a captive dependency problem. And again, if I'm running in development, or if I have this flag flipped on, then I'll get this error saying, hey, it cannot consume a scope service from singleton, from the singleton service. So this is the error that you would get if you have development mode turned on, but I see a lot of people might change that environment to like dev or local or whatever the case may be. But you can have this always run. You can just say, hey, validate on build and override the default service provider. And that on build name is kind of like, you might think you get a compiler warning, but it's actually like after it builds, but it's actually a runtime error. And the build is when it builds the service provider, when it builds the DI container and like grabs all your dependencies and tries to build it, which it does that when your app boots. So that's what the validate on build does. So now you'll get it anytime, get that error anytime you're running, whether you're in development mode or not. So something to look into there. So that's kind of an obscure one, but something I do on every .NET app. All right. I think we should have enough time for the rest. Let's talk about automated tests for a second. So first off, let's just talk about the basics of you should be writing automated tests. Like again, there's the same research I talked about earlier, that DORA research where they've interviewed tens of thousands of teams, and the teams that write automated tests can move faster and more reliably than those that don't. And it also results in lower deployment pain as well as reduced burnout on the team. Because if you think about it, when you start small and just do manual testing, maybe that's okay to start. But then as you keep adding more and more features, now you got to manually regression test more and more stuff, and that just does not scale well over the long term, right? So you need to be adding automated tests as you scale and add more and more features throughout your application. And again, there's independent research. If you need to convince your team or your boss, there's a link there. You can grab the slides later that it's like, hey, this is literally independent research. Like, this isn't my idea. This is like independent research that has been done to prove out automated tests are a good thing. I also like using XUnit, or if you use NUnit, that's totally fine too. Just I don't like MS Test because it's a little bit more verbose. And ironically, Microsoft created MS Test, hence the MS part. And they don't actually use MS Test. They use XUnit on the ASP.NET team. So I think that's kind of funny that they don't even use their own stuff. So generally I use XUnit, but again, the more important thing here is that you're writing automated tests, not necessarily like the framework that you're using. So, but if you're picking something new, or if you need to convince people, I would probably start with XUnit. And again, the simple answer is, well, Microsoft's using it. And usually when Microsoft's using it, we're all like, oh yeah, that sounds good. Let's do that. Because we usually listen to Microsoft. But note, there is a new package that XUnit released called xunit.v3. So they released a v3 of the package, but they did not bump the version of their existing package. They called it xunit.v3. A lot of reasons for that. I'm not going to get into it, but a lot of people who are using XUnit don't even know that this package is out here. So I wanted to call that out for anybody who is not using the XUnit v3 package. And that just came out like in the last 6-ish months. So very likely you might not be using it. All right. Does anybody know who this guy is? Chekhov. How did you know that? Does anybody know what his first name is? Anton. Nailed it. So this guy, and I swear I'm going to tie this into automated testing here in a second, but Anton Chekhov was a Russian playwright in the 1800s. And he had this idea, he has this quote, which basically means, hey, if you've got a rifle hanging on the wall in chapter 1, you should fire it off in a later chapter. Otherwise, that rifle shouldn't be hanging there in the first place. So basically what he's trying to say is everything should have meaning, which is Game of Thrones popular here? Yeah, unfortunately, Game of Thrones did not follow that philosophy that everything should have meaning, but sorry for anybody who's still sour about that. But we can actually apply Chekhov's gun of everything should have meaning to our automated tests. What is not relevant in this particular automated test? See some people muttering. Anybody want to shout it out? First name and birth date are not relevant, and address are not relevant to this test. And I see this all the time where people put way too much setup code in their range step of their tests. So last name is really the only thing that matters here, because we're testing that, hey, when last name is empty, that, hey, we get a validation error. And this is not using Fluent validation, by the way. This is just using raw code, raw C# code. So what you can do is you can rip that out and like create a valid customer, like have a factory method or something, or some people use random data too, whatever that case is. But it's a little bit more clear, like, hey, the only thing I care about is last name here. But usually what I do in XUnit is you can rip that out into the constructor and have like a field that's keeping track of that. And then I'll just like set the last name there. And some people think like, oh, aren't you sharing state now? And the answer is no, because before each test in the same class, a new class gets instantiated every single time. So that's why if you've ever noticed, your tests will run sequentially inside the same class, but test classes run in parallel. So that's how almost all testing frameworks work. And so XUnit also does the same thing, and it generates a new class every single time you run the test. So you're not sharing state whatsoever. But you can also do that on the customer validator. So I was newing it up before, and usually I rip that out to the constructor as well. So if we compare the two, the top one, there's a lot more noise going on, and the bottom one, it's a little bit more clear of what is going on in this test. So this is an example of me applying Chekhov's gun to automated testing, that everything should be relevant in the story inside of your test. Okay, that is automated testing. Hopefully I've convinced you to write automated tests. Now we're going to switch to central package management. How many people use this today? Okay, probably like 10, 15 people, maybe like 5, 10% of the room. So the problem here that central package management solves is you might have the same package in multiple projects across your solution, and it can be annoying to keep those in sync. Like for instance, test projects, like if you've got XUnit, mock, and substitute, keeping all those versions in sync is annoying. And I find most people, like in this room, don't know if central package management exists. So what it is in .NET 6, they added this feature where you can create a directory.packages.props at the root and define the packages and versions there that you care about. And then you remove the version in your CS proj, and all packages in your project have to remove that version attribute, but you can override it with like a version override. So what that looks like is in your directory packages props file, you can say like XUnit version 2.6.6, and then in all of your consuming CS projects, you just say XUnit. And now when you want to upgrade XUnit, all of your projects get it, not just like you don't have to bounce around to every single CS proj, which is kind of nice. All right, down to the last 7 minutes. So we're going to do some bonus topics here and just hit on some bonus tips. So if you're ever wondering what SQL queries Entity Framework is making, Entity Framework will actually tell you this. So all you need to do is switch the log level of this namespace, Microsoft.entityframeworkcore.database.command, to information. But please only do this for local development. Like, do not log every SQL statement in production, because you're going to eat up a ton of space in your logs. Like, please only do this for local dev. So how you do that is, I mean, you can do this in code too in Serlog, but if you're using the app settings, you can set that log level to information, and then it'll output something that you see here on the bottom. So I'll zoom in here a little bit again. And you can see like there's insert statements there, select statements, all of that kind of stuff. So that's what Entity Framework is generating under the hood. All right, some more bonus topics. CI/CD pipelines. If you're not using them, like this is probably my #1 thing to add. is you should be using CI/CD pipelines, which I've noticed like over time, I have to convince people less and less of things. Like I still have to convince people automated tests are good, but I usually don't have to convince people CI/CD pipelines are good. So if you're not using CI/CD pipelines, please create them. If you want to learn more about that, come talk to me afterwards, and I'd be happy to talk about it. But there's also this concept of confident green, which Tim, who's now taking a selfie in the crowd, is kind of coined this term internally. And so this idea is the idea of, hey, when your pipeline's green, why aren't you deploying that all the way to production? Why aren't you doing continuous deployment, not delivery, deployment, where you're deploying it all the way out to production? And so usually when you ask this question, people are like, oh, well, I always go to like the dev environment, kind of click around and make sure everything's good. And it's like, cool, that sounds like an automated test you could write. So let's go ahead and write that automated test. And then some people, it's like, okay, now why? Now why can't you deploy to production? It's like, oh, well, I don't have zero downtime deployments, so we can't deploy to production because I don't want to take stuff down. It's like, cool, let's fix that. Now why? And you keep going through this iterative process until you kind of run out of reasons. So somebody I know who works at Amazon forces continuous deployment on you. Like you cannot do anything other than continuous deployment. And what I found is when you force that, people will write a lot better automated tests. They'll have better conversations up front with the product people and all of those kinds of things. But you're going to need something called feature toggles, which is basically this concept of, hey, this feature isn't quite ready yet, so toggle it on in lower environments, but turn it off in production. And really, feature toggles are just a fancy word for an if statement. That's really all they are at the end of the day. So feature toggles are also important, and also something that DORA research I was talking about earlier has proven that, hey, people move faster, more confidently if they're using this practice. Another tip is work in small batches. So do not, like, if you're consistently working on stories for like weeks and months, that's probably a sign that maybe you could break the work down smaller. And in general, like when you deploy something, if you're deploying like one small thing at a time and you're doing like continuous deployment, well, if there's ever an issue, you probably know it was that small thing that you worked on, not the 100 things that you've been working on this month that you're shipping all at the same time, right? So try and work in small batches and deploy frequently to production. Like ideally, I want daily or even more frequent deployments to production. And not like monthly or any of those kinds of cadences. So some real benefits of these practices. One company we worked with went from deploying twice or 12 times a year, so monthly, and rolling back about half of those to deploying over 2,000 times in a year and rolling back less than 1% of those. So what that means is you're getting stuff out faster, more reliably. Developers are happier. Users are happier because they're getting more things in their hands quicker. And ultimately, that leads to better outcomes for everybody. There's also DORA metrics. I'm not going to get into that, but if you click that link, you can actually quiz yourself and see kind of where you rank in your industry on things like deployment frequency, bug percentage, things like that. So that site is at dora.dev. But again, I'll send these slides out in Slack, and you can also grab them on my blog too. All right, to wrap up here, some takeaways. Hopefully you got at least one idea today. Again, I want you to come back to NDC Oslo. And so hopefully you can go tell your boss, like, hey, I learned these 1, 2, 3, 4 things. So they feel at least better about, making the investment of sending you here. And again, the slide deck you can use as a resource. I intentionally left this detailed because I always hate when you look at somebody's slides and it's like, oh, well, that's not a nice picture, but I don't remember what they said about that picture. So I try and keep things detailed so that you know exactly what I said about that topic. All right, we've got 2 minutes for questions. Maybe I'll just say if you've got questions, come up afterwards. I've also got my contact info as well as this QR code. If you want to add me on LinkedIn and ask me a question, because I know not everybody wants to ask questions around other people, you can contact me on my email, Blue Sky, Twitter, or LinkedIn as well. But yeah, thanks for coming, everybody, and have a great NDC Oslo.